Welcome back to MadMinds, where legends aren't just told, they're revived. You've heard the myth of Atlantis, the city swallowed by the sea. But what if it didn't sink? What if it became us? This isn't just a story about a lost world. It's a warning, one we're running out of time to hear. If you enjoy these stories, hit subscribe, leave a comment with what you'd like us to explore next, and join us as we dive into the forgotten depths. This is Atlantis, and it may not be as far away as you think. Before Egypt carved its gods into stone with fingers bloodied by ambition, before Babylon raised its towers like desperate prayers to silent heavens, there whispered through time a city older than memory itself, richer than Solomon's dreams, wiser than the serpent in Eden, a place built not merely with marble and gold, but with the breath of gods themselves. Where kings didn't seize their crowns, they were chosen by divine hands that still touched the earth. Where streets didn't just gleam with precious metals but pulsed with orichalcum, a substance that caught starlight and held it prisoner, burning like captured fire in the palm of mortals who had forgotten they were mortal. Atlantis. The name itself tastes of salt and secrets, a word that maps have tried to forget, that scholars have buried beneath mountains of doubt, that time has attempted to drown in its own tide. Yet it refuses to die. The first time our world heard this name, it didn't emerge from crumbling ruins or ancient tablets worn smooth by desperate fingers. It came from Plato, the philosopher whose thoughts still shape our reality, whose words we trust more than our own reflections. In 360 BCE, with the weight of Athens heavy on his shoulders, he committed to parchment a tale that had traveled through generations like a fever dream. An empire beyond the pillars of Heracles, where the known world bled into mystery. An empire so vast it made Rome look like a village. So advanced it made Athens seem like children playing with mud and sticks. So powerful it didn't just challenge kings or armies, it challenged the gods themselves. And the gods, Plato whispered into history's ear, destroyed it in a single day. But this wasn't conquest. This wasn't the slow strangulation of siege or the passionate brutality of war. This was something far more terrifying: erasure, complete and absolute, as if the universe itself had decided Atlantis was a mistake that needed correcting. The story tells us they had everything mortals could desire: wealth that made Midas weep with envy, wisdom that put oracles to shame, technology that harnessed the very forces of creation, power that could reshape continents, and still, they hungered. They gazed across their paradise and saw only what they didn't yet possess. They looked at the world beyond their crystalline shores and saw not neighbors, but subjects waiting to kneel. In their pursuit of absolute dominion, they forgot the delicate laws that had kept their paradise floating between heaven and earth. Picture this. One morning, the sun rose over marble towers that pierced clouds like needles threading the sky. Crystal canals reflected light that seemed borrowed from other worlds. Golden domes caught the dawn and threw it back transformed, more beautiful than any sunrise had a right to be. By nightfall, silence owned the world. No ruins jutting from angry waves, no bones scattered across the seafloor like accusations, no survivors clinging to wreckage with stories to tell and warnings to give, just the ocean stretching endless and innocent as if Atlantis had never drawn breath at all. They became more than a cautionary tale. They became a ghost story that civilization tells itself, a parable wrapped in salt and regret, warning us that pride doesn't just come before the fall. Sometimes pride becomes the flood itself. But here's what haunts the margins of every history book, what whispers in the spaces between Plato's carefully chosen words. What if this wasn't just philosophy wrapped in myth? What if Plato didn't birth Atlantis from his imagination, but inherited it like a curse passed down through bloodlines of memory? What if somewhere beneath our rational, measured world, there really was a civilization so magnificent and so terrible that the earth itself chose to forget? And what if that forgetting was never quite complete? In the deep places of the Sahara, where sand covers secrets older than written words. In the crushing darkness of Atlantic trenches, where pressure guards mysteries light has never touched. in the dreams of prophets who wake screaming names they've never heard, in the cold sweats of kings who fear shadows that have no source. Atlantis endures, not as a place you could sail to or map coordinates for, but as something far more dangerous, a mirror that shows us exactly what we've become. And when we stare too long into its depths, when we lean too close to its surface, we begin to see ourselves staring back. This is not a story about the past, safely buried beneath comfortable centuries of distance. This is a story about what happens when mortals reach for heaven, when memory becomes inconvenient, when we convince ourselves that the laws of rise and fall don't apply to us. This is the story of Atlantis. And it begins not with discovery, not with triumph, not with the satisfying click of puzzle pieces falling into place, but with a warning that's already too late. Plato gave the world a treasure map drawn in words instead of ink, not the crude scratches of desperate pirates marking spots where gold lay buried, but something far more precious and infinitely more dangerous, a blueprint for paradise, and perhaps, without knowing it, a recipe for its destruction. He described Atlantis with the precision of an architect who had walked its streets, breathed its perfumed air, felt the warmth of its sun on skin that had never known winter. An island nation larger than Libya and Asia combined, he said, a continent disguised as an island, vast enough to swallow empires and still have room for dreams. Situated beyond the pillars of Heracles, where the Mediterranean exhales into the infinite Atlantic and the familiar world ends like a sentence cut mid-word, surrounded by mountains that scraped the belly of heaven, blessed with rivers that sang as they flowed, forests where every tree held secrets, and creatures that had forgotten they were supposed to be extinct. And the wealth, God, the wealth, not just gold or silver or precious stones, those were common as sand in Atlantis. Their riches ran deeper, stranger. They commanded metals that didn't exist anywhere else, elements that modern science would dismiss as impossible, until the moment it encountered them burning in laboratories, defying every law they thought immutable. Plato painted their cities with words that still shimmer on ancient pages, concentric rings of land and water spiraling inward like a geometric prayer, with canals that didn't just carry boats, but seemed to carry light itself, refracting and amplifying it until their waterways gleamed like liquid starlight. Temples that weren't just built but grown, as if the very stones had been convinced to take shapes that defied gravity and good sense. He told us how their kings ruled, not through fear or force, but through laws that seemed to breathe with divine wisdom, maintaining perfect balance between power and restraint, ambition and humility, the needs of the many and the desires of the few, until the balance broke, until the kings began to see themselves as gods instead of servants, until the laws bent to accommodate pride instead of justice, until Atlantis forgot that paradise is not a right to be claimed, but a gift that must be earned again each day. Plato gave us everything: blueprints and philosophy, measurements and poetry, warnings wrapped in wonder, everything except coordinates, everything except proof. For thousands of years, that absence has driven explorers mad with longing. They've chased Plato's riddle across every ocean, beneath every sea, through jungles and deserts, and ice fields that crack under the weight of desperate hope. Some claim to find it in the Caribbean, where underwater formations seem too regular to be natural, too perfect to be accident. Others swore it lay beneath Antarctica's ice, a continent-sized grave marker for a civilization that had frozen rather than drowned. Madmen with maps covered in red string pointed to the Sahara, insisting that what we call desert was once an ocean floor, and beneath those endless dunes lay streets that once rang with laughter and ambition. A few, drunk on their own certainty, even looked beyond Earth entirely, to Mars, where satellite images showed scars that might once have been canals, might once have carried water and life and dreams that ended badly. Some found patterns in pixels, arrangements of shadows that computer algorithms insisted were too symmetrical for nature. Some discovered ruins off the coast of Spain, stone formations that sonar couldn't quite explain, that dating methods couldn't quite pin down, that oceanographers couldn't quite dismiss. Some claimed dreams as evidence, past life regressions that felt more real than memory, visions that came with the taste of salt and the sound of breaking crystal, knowledge of streets they had never walked, and languages they had never learned. But none found Atlantis, because perhaps, just perhaps, it was never meant to be found on any map drawn by human hands. What if Plato wasn't describing a place you could plot longitude and latitude for, wasn't giving directions to somewhere you could book passage to on the next departing ship? What if Atlantis was never a location at all, but a pattern written into the DNA of civilization itself, a warning encoded in history's bones, waiting to be decoded by minds wise enough to recognize the symptoms before the fever kills the patient, a warning that reads, when power grows faster than wisdom, when ambition outpaces conscience, when a civilization begins to believe its own myths of invincibility, collapse is not just possible, it's inevitable. Still, the theories multiply like viruses, spreading through internet forums and documentary films and books that promise to reveal the truth that they don't want you to know, because there's something in the silence that breeds suspicion, something in the absence of evidence that feels like evidence of absence. Why would Plato, the philosopher who taught us to question shadows on cave walls, who built the foundations of Western thought with his own hands, risk his reputation on what critics dismissively call noble lies and philosophical fairy tales? Why does every culture on Earth carry flood myths in their collective memory? Noah's Ark, Mesopotamian deluges, Hindu dissolutions, Native American purification legends, different names for the same terror, the same pattern of divine punishment, washing away civilizations that forgot their place in the cosmic order. Why do ruins appear where no civilization should have built? Why do ancient maps show coastlines that didn't exist when they were drawn? Why do DNA studies reveal human migration patterns that make no sense unless there were land masses where only ocean exists today? What if the reason we can't find Atlantis on our maps is because we've been standing on its bones the whole time? What if the coordinates aren't written in latitude and longitude, but in patterns of behavior, cycles of rise and fall, symptoms of civilizational sickness that repeat like clockwork across cultures and centuries? What if Atlantis doesn't have a location because it never needed one? It exists wherever mortals convince themselves they've transcended mortality, wherever gods are forgotten in favor of gold, wherever the balance tips from harmony toward domination. Atlantis may not have coordinates you can punch into a GPS device, but it has fingerprints, and they're pressed into every page of the history we thought we understood. You can silence a city with enough violence and time, burn its libraries until knowledge becomes ash that dances on indifferent winds, topple its statues until heroes become rubble ground beneath the wheels of conquest, murder its poets until songs die stillborn in throats that no longer dare to open. You can flood its streets until familiar paths become alien territories explored only by fish. Bury its foundations beneath centuries of accumulated sediment until architecture becomes archaeology. Erase its name from official records until bureaucracy completes what warfare began. But stories are harder to kill than cities. Stories learn to swim, they adapt, evolve, find ways to survive in hostile environments. They slip through the cracks of censorship, hide in the margins of approved histories, disguise themselves as myths and legends and fairy tales that parents whisper to children who are too young to understand their terrible weight. The flood myth doesn't belong exclusively to Atlantis or Greece or Plato's philosophical imagination. It surfaces everywhere human memory reaches back toward its own origins, a recurring nightmare that civilization keeps having about itself. In Genesis, where Noah builds his ark against waters that rise to swallow every living thing, wiping the slate clean so creation can begin again with fewer mistakes. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utnapishtim survives a divine deluge sent to punish humanity's noise and presumption. In Hindu scriptures, where Vishnu's fish avatar guides Manu's boat through waters that dissolve one cosmic age to birth another. Different names, different gods, different boats, same fear. The terror that somewhere in the deep structure of existence, there's a reset button, that when civilizations grow too proud, too loud, too forgetful of their place in the cosmic hierarchy, something vast and patient and implacable rises from the depths to restore the balance. What if Atlantis wasn't unique? What if it wasn't the first, or even the last? What if it was simply the most recent in a cycle that turns like a great wheel, grinding civilizations between its spokes, pulverizing empires into lessons that future peoples are too arrogant to learn? There are places where the water remembers what the land has forgotten. Off the coast of India, where marine archaeologists have discovered structures that shouldn't exist, cities that were supposedly built when the sea level was 400 feet lower than today, when the continental shelf stretched miles further into what is now empty ocean. Stone foundations laid out in grids too regular for nature, too sophisticated for the primitive peoples who historians insist were the only inhabitants of that time and place. Beneath Lake Titicaca, where sonar reveals pyramids and pathways that predate the Inca by thousands of years, built when the lake was smaller and the air was thicker and the laws of physics may have been more forgiving. Structures that seem designed for beings who breathed different atmosphere, who moved through water as easily as air, who understood principles of engineering that modern science is only beginning to rediscover. Under the Black Sea, where sudden sea level rise turned fertile valleys into underwater graveyards, preserving ancient settlements in salty amber, while the survivors fled to higher ground with stories of paradise lost to divine wrath. Cities that thrived when the Mediterranean was a lake and the climate was kind and the gods still walked among their children. We dismiss these anomalies as coincidence, as natural formations that our pattern-seeking brains misinterpret as intelligent design. We file them under unexplained and move on to more comfortable mysteries that don't threaten our carefully constructed timelines of human development. But what if these aren't separate phenomena? What if they're fragments of the same shattered mirror, pieces of a pattern too large for any single generation to perceive? Not just about Atlantis, but about the species that built it, us. Because Atlantis isn't just a story about technological collapse or environmental disaster or the wrath of angry gods. It's a story about forgetting, about the terrible human talent for erasing our own footsteps, for convincing ourselves that this time will be different, that we've learned from past mistakes even as we repeat them with mechanical precision. What made Atlantis truly powerful, truly dangerous, wasn't just its wealth or wisdom or divine favor, it was its ability to vanish so completely that its destruction became indistinguishable from myth. No mass graves to mark the moment when paradise became purgatory, no broken weapons to tell the tale of final battles, no scrolls preserving the last thoughts of poets who watched their world disappear beneath rising waters. Just absence, clean, complete, terrible absence. That's the real horror embedded in Plato's account. Not that Atlantis fell. Civilizations fall constantly, violently, memorably. History is littered with the bones of empires that thought themselves eternal, but that it was allowed to fall, that no one intervened when the balance shifted, that no neighboring peoples sent aid when the symptoms appeared, that no gods descended from their celestial heights to restore order before chaos could complete its work, that the world watched paradise drown and then forgot it had ever existed at all. Because civilizations don't truly die when their walls crumble or their armies surrender or their treasuries empty. They die when their names are spoken for the last time, when the final witness closes their eyes, when the last story is told, and no one remains to pass it on. And yet, Atlantis refuses to die that final death. Its name still echoes in places where echoes shouldn't survive. It haunts conversations about science and spirituality, politics and philosophy, environmental collapse, and technological transcendence, which means something is still alive in those depths, something that doesn't want to be forgotten, something that needs to be remembered, even if, especially if, the remembering is painful. Maybe it's waiting in the spaces between waves, in the silence between heartbeats, in the pause between one civilization's end and another's beginning, waiting for us to recognize the pattern, to see the symptoms, to understand that the flood isn't something that happened once to other people in distant times. The flood is something that happens whenever mortals forget they're mortal, and the water is already rising around our ankles. In Atlantis, the gods were not distant abstractions painted on temple walls or reduced to philosophical concepts debated in marble halls. They walked the streets with footsteps that left impressions in stone. They breathed the same salt-sweet air, felt the same sun-warming skin that glowed with more than mortal radiance. They shared meals at tables where conversation flowed like wine, where wisdom was passed between divine and mortal hands like sacred flame. Poseidon, lord of the restless seas, was their patron and protector, not just in name or symbol, but in living presence. He was the one who shaped their island with his own hands, carving those perfect concentric rings of land and water with the patient artistry of a sculptor who had all eternity to perfect his masterpiece. He gave it to his 10 sons like a father presenting the ultimate inheritance, not just wealth or territory, but paradise itself made manifest in marble and gold. And for generations that stretched like golden threads through time, they ruled with wisdom that seemed to flow directly from divine springs. They honored the delicate balance between earth and sea, between mortal ambition and cosmic harmony. Their laws weren't written by committees or imposed by force. They grew naturally from principles that the gods had whispered into the hearts of those pure enough to listen. They built temples not as monuments to their own glory, but as gathering places where human and divine could meet in fellowship that enriched both. Their offerings weren't bribes or insurance policies against celestial wrath, but expressions of gratitude for gifts, too numerous to count, too precious to take for granted. They understood what mortals in every age struggle to remember, that power is not a possession to be hoarded, but a current that must flow or corrupt everything it touches. But power is like the tide. It rises so slowly that those standing in it don't notice the water climbing past their ankles, their knees, their hearts, until the moment they realize they can no longer touch bottom and the shore has disappeared beyond reach. As generations passed like pages turning in a book whose ending nobody bothered to read, something fundamental shifted in the souls of Poseidon's heirs. The divine blood that flowed in their veins began to thin, diluted not by time, but by choices that seemed insignificant when made alone, but catastrophic in accumulation. They stopped visiting the temples with the same frequency, the same reverence. Prayer became perfunctory ritual rather than genuine communion. The festivals that had once pulsed with authentic joy and gratitude transformed into hollow ceremonies performed more from habit than devotion. They began to see themselves not as servants blessed with divine favor, but as inheritors of divine right. The distinction seems subtle, but it yawns like an abyss between humility and pride, between stewardship and ownership, between partnership with the gods and competition with them. Their laws, once flowing from celestial wisdom, began to bend to accommodate earthly desires. Justice became negotiable. Truth became flexible. The sacred geometry of their society, once perfectly aligned with cosmic principles, started to warp under the weight of accumulated compromises. They stopped building temples and started building monuments to themselves. Their art no longer celebrated divine beauty but human achievement. Their literature sang not of gods and heroes, but of conquest and accumulation. Their philosophers debated not how to live in harmony with cosmic order, but how to transcend it entirely. And their offerings to the gods, their offerings became tokens, perfunctory gestures made by people who no longer remembered why they were necessary, coins tossed into temples like tips left for service workers, not sacred sacrifices acknowledging dependence on powers greater than themselves, until finally, inevitably, the offerings stopped entirely, not with dramatic declarations of independence or philosophical manifestos rejecting divine authority. They simply forgot, the way a stream forgets to flow when its source dries up, the way a heart forgets to beat when the spirit that animated it finds better places to dwell. The gods didn't respond with rage, though rage would have been justified. They didn't hurl thunderbolts or send plagues or manifest as terrible apparitions to remind their ungrateful children who held the real power in this relationship. They simply turned away. like parents finally accepting that their children are determined to learn through consequences rather than wisdom, divine attention shifted elsewhere. Not in anger. Gods have patience that makes mountains seem hasty, but in profound, cosmic sadness. When gods withdraw their presence from a place, they take more than their blessings. They take the invisible threads that hold reality together, the subtle influences that maintain balance between opposing forces, the gentle pressure that keeps chaos from overwhelming order. They take memory, the ability to remember why certain things matter more than others, why some paths lead to flourishing while others lead to ruin, why humility is not weakness, but the foundation of all genuine strength. They take protection, not just from external enemies, but from internal contradictions that tear civilizations apart from within, from the slow poison of unchecked ambition, from the cancer of pride that grows until it consumes its host. Most dangerously, they take balance itself, the delicate equilibrium between expansion and restraint, between innovation and tradition, between reaching for heaven and remembering that you're still standing on earth. And without balance, even paradise begins to rot. The symptoms appeared gradually, like fever building in a body that hasn't yet recognized it's sick. The earth trembled beneath foundations that had stood firm for millennia. The sea grew restless, sending waves to test walls that had never needed testing before. The climate shifted, became unpredictable, as if the natural world itself was trying to communicate something urgent in a language that Atlantis had forgotten how to understand. But they interpreted these signs not as warnings, but as challenges to be overcome through greater application of the same principles that had caused the problems in the first place. Instead of returning to the temples, they built higher walls. Instead of making offerings to appease the sea, they constructed more elaborate defenses against its moods. Instead of questioning whether they had broken some fundamental law, they convinced themselves that they had transcended the need for laws entirely. The earth shook harder, the sea rose higher, and Atlantis, untouched by foreign conquest, unmarked by plague or famine, blessed with every material advantage that mortals could desire, fell to divine silence in the span of a single day. Was it punishment? Was it justice? Was it simply the natural consequence of laws broken and balance abandoned? Perhaps the distinction doesn't matter. Perhaps what matters is the pattern repeated throughout history with mechanical precision, that no civilization, no matter how advanced, no matter how blessed, no matter how convinced of its own permanence, survives the withdrawal of whatever forces keep it aligned with deeper principles of existence. Atlantis didn't fall because the gods were cruel. It fell because it forgot they existed at all. And maybe that's why we still search for it, still tell its story, still feel drawn to its mystery like moths to flame that burned out long ago, not to find archaeological proof of sunken cities or technological marvels buried beneath the waves, but to hear the warning echo across the centuries one more time, to feel its weight settle in our chests like a stone, to remember that the relationship between mortal and divine is not a contract to be negotiated, but a dance that requires constant attention to steps we didn't choreograph and music we didn't compose, before the sea comes for us too, before the gods turn away from us as well, before our own paradise learns to forget its name. Atlantis was never just a city of marble towers piercing morning mist or crystal canals reflecting light that seemed borrowed from other dimensions. It was a mirror, a looking glass held up to every civilization that has ever convinced itself it was different, special, chosen, immune to the laws that govern the rise and fall of all human endeavors. And when we lean close enough to see our own reflection in its polished surface, when we stare long enough into its depths, the resemblance is terrifying. We imagine them in their final days, proud and powerful and utterly convinced of their own permanence, building wonders that scrape the bottom of heaven while remaining blind to the cracks spreading through their foundations, trading in gold and orichalcum and exotic spices while losing track of the invisible currencies that actually mattered: trust, wisdom, balance, humility. They commanded technologies that harnessed the fundamental forces of creation, bent elements to their will, manipulated matter and energy with the casual expertise of gods who had forgotten they were mortal. They believed they had solved the ancient riddle of existence, transcended the limitations that had hobbled every previous generation. But underneath their marble facades, rot. Beneath their temples to forgotten gods, silence. Behind their magnificent pride, fear. Because even Atlantis, at the very peak of its glory, must have sensed what was coming. There must have been moments in the space between heartbeats, in the pause between one breath and the next, when the whole elaborate structure shuddered with premonition, a trembling in the earth that felt different from ordinary earthquakes, a strange stillness in the sky that pressed down like held breath, a quality to the light that suggested something vast and patient was preparing to close its eyes forever. The wise ones among them, if any remained, must have recognized the symptoms, must have felt the gods withdrawing their presence like warmth leaving a dying body, must have understood that paradise is not a destination you arrive at and settle into, but a state of being that requires constant vigilance, constant humility, constant remembering of principles their civilization had chosen to forget. And now, here we stand, we who build towers of glass and steel that pierce clouds but never quite reach heaven. We who worship algorithms and market fluctuations with the same fervor our ancestors reserved for gods who actually listen to prayers. We who float on vast oceans of data and mistake information for wisdom, connectivity for communion, technological capability for spiritual evolution. We who have forgotten how to build temples because we've convinced ourselves we no longer need the gods they were designed to honor. Look around you. See the Atlantis we have built without recognizing its familiar architecture. We live in cities that consume resources faster than nature can replenish them, yet we call this progress and assume it can continue indefinitely. We've created economic systems that require infinite growth on a finite planet, yet we're genuinely surprised when the mathematics of impossibility finally come due. We worship innovation without wisdom, change without direction, disruption without consideration for what valuable things might be destroyed in the process. We mistake the ability to do something for the right to do it, confuse technological capability with moral permission. We've built machines that think faster than we do, make decisions we don't understand, shape behaviors we're unaware of exhibiting. We've surrendered more and more of our agency to systems that optimize for metrics we didn't choose in service of goals we never consciously set. We've created networks that connect every human on the planet while leaving us more isolated than any generation in recorded history. We've built platforms that amplify every voice while ensuring that wisdom whispers, while folly shouts from every rooftop. We consume more than we create, extract more than we give back, take more than we offer. We've convinced ourselves that because we can measure and quantify and digitize nearly everything, we understand it all. We mistake our models for reality, our maps for the territory, our explanations for the mysteries they pretend to solve. We are doing exactly what they did, building faster than we can think, consuming more than we can give back, turning away from balance, from humility, from the ancient forms of memory that once kept civilizations tethered to principles larger than their immediate desires. Atlantis wasn't lost in a single catastrophic night, despite what the stories tell us. It was lost one choice at a time, one compromise at a time, one forgotten truth at a time, one moment when someone decided that old wisdom was less important than new possibilities, that traditional restraints were obstacles to be overcome rather than guidelines to be respected. Until the wave came, until the balance shifted past the point of recovery, until the gods finished turning away and the protective forces that had kept their paradise afloat simply let go. And no one was watching the tide gauge because everyone was too busy watching their stock portfolios. The terrifying truth is that Atlantis is not a lost continent lying beneath Atlantic waves, waiting for marine archaeologists to stumble across its ruins with cameras and carbon dating equipment. Atlantis is all around us. It's in our smart cities that monitor every movement while forgetting to nurture human souls. It's in our global markets that can transfer billions across continents in milliseconds, but can't figure out how to feed the hungry or house the homeless. It's in our social networks that can organize flash mobs and overthrow governments but struggle to facilitate genuine human connection. It's in our universities that produce graduates who can manipulate genes and split atoms but have never learned to find meaning in suffering or purpose in limitation. It's in our leaders who can wage war with precision-guided munitions but can't wage peace with precision-guided wisdom. It's in every moment when we choose convenience over consequence, efficiency over ethics, innovation over integration with the deeper patterns that govern sustainable existence. We are Atlantis. We are the proud civilization that believes it has transcended the rules that governed all previous experiments in human organization. We are the advanced society that has forgotten why those rules existed in the first place. We are the blessed inheritors of paradise who have gradually stopped maintaining our relationship with whatever forces blessed us with it. And the flood Plato wrote about, the great deluge that swallowed the greatest civilization the world had ever known, it has already begun. Not with rising ocean levels, though those are rising. Not with climate change, though the climate is changing. Not with economic collapse, though that collapse is increasingly inevitable. The flood that destroys civilizations is always, ultimately, spiritual. It's the rising tide of meaninglessness that drowns purpose. It's the deluge of noise that washes away the ability to hear wisdom. It's the tsunami of distraction that sweeps away presence, attention, the capacity to remain awake to what actually matters. We are drowning in our own success. We are Atlantis, and we are sinking. The only question now is whether enough of us will learn to swim before the water closes over our heads forever, or whether some future Plato will write our story as a cautionary tale for civilizations not yet born, warning them about the people who built wonders that touched the sky, but forgot to keep their feet on solid ground.